Welcome everybody, good afternoon. I am between you and either the traffic or some happy hour or drink social. I really appreciate you coming along to hear the story that is FanDuel. My name is Shane Sweeney. I'm the Senior Vice President of Technology here in FanDuel Atlanta. I've been working across our global organization called Flutter for the last 14 years, and over the last 2 or 3 years, we focused on FanDuel and our emerging business that hopefully a few of you have heard about over the last year or two as we've been launching new products in new states. You'll see our logos on ESPN and various other TV channels. The story today is about how we've been using Amazon to help us to accelerate our business whilst addressing the regulatory landscape that we operate in, our performance, our customer experience, everything and anything. And hopefully you all leave not just thinking about the drinks mixer or happy hour. What do I want you to all walk away from today? These are really exciting problems and I'd really like to be part of solving that potentially. With some really interesting challenges, and we hopefully you'll learn about different creative ways in which we've solved for some of them. And more generally, it's a really exciting company to work for, a really interesting industry. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. So, FanDuel Group, who are we? For those of you who don't know, we are the largest online real money gaming operator in. It's actually now North America since these slides were created. So not just the United States, but in North America, which is the US and more recently in Canada. We do everything from sports betting. We have a daily fantasy business. We have a horse racing business called TVG that comes with a couple of TV stations that we're presenting and streaming through OTT apps, just as much as we are over satellite down to DirecTV. And we have a casino business where in the various different states that we are operating, very similar to a Las Vegas style experience, but just in a web browser. Here in Atlanta, we've just launched our new tech hub. We built a new purpose-built location in Ponce City Market where we aim to hire up to 900 engineers. Again, if anybody is interested, please feel free to come and talk to me afterwards. Really exciting office, really exciting location, and we see this as a really valuable location for us to be based in. So it was a pleasure to be able to come to Summit Atlanta and share our story. So what is the landscape that is FanDuel? So these are our 4 products that I described. We are operating in 15 different states with our sports betting business, and we've just recently launched in Canada. We have about 25 or 30 retail locations, which is part of our sports betting business across 16 states. Our daily fantasy business operates somewhere between 34 and 35 states, and our racing business operates somewhere between 41 states at any moment. So across all 50 states across the United States. We have a TV studio, and again, casino is live and operating in 5 different states across the US. So why is that special? Well, we are a major e-commerce platform. We are effectively a trading floor, and we are also effectively like a bank with lots of money flowing through our systems. And that means we have heavy regulation. We have internally a really core focus on making sure that this new industry here in the United States has a big focus on responsible gaming. We have significant data residency requirements. What does that mean? I'll come back to that in a minute. But more importantly, latency is crucial, right? It is the number one thing that we need to make sure from a risk perspective. We are the sports betting business. We're taking wagers. We have to know everything about a sport, everything about an event in about as close to real time as we can. And we have to make choices based on that data, which I'll get into in a few minutes. So, what do we do with AWS? Why are we here? So a lot of our workloads, the ones that span across multiple states, we really like cloud for our business. Why do we like it? It's based on sporting events. We have lots of tentpole events throughout the year. We have to scale up our services, scale down our services. We are the best type of workload for the cloud, if ever there was one, because On Super Bowl Sunday, we scale up to nearly 30 to 40 times what we need on a regular Monday or Tuesday. And across each of these different platforms, different requirements exist. And you don't want to be operating in the physical world and the physical data centers and the constraints that brings for lots of really obvious reasons. So our fantasy business, we have some of our front-end platforms are all hosted in the cloud. Our racing business is also hosted in the cloud. And various different examples of what these pages look like. Again, I'm not going to get into our products. They all work in very different ways. They're taking data feeds from sports, and we're aggregating that data and allowing people to enter competitions or place wagers or have a game of poker or roulette or whatever. Now we come to the hard part. So they're the workloads that are in the cloud. We're fit for purpose in the cloud. However, our sportsbook, our wallet platform, and our casino platform are the ones that are most regulated. And the regulations come in many different forms, but ultimately it means that we need to host these platforms in every state in a data center that is normally in our control, but in some cases not. And we have to typically rely upon building our own infrastructure to try and link all these different data centers together. Again, I'm going to come back to that latency. 15 different data centers, 16 different states for our retail locations, up to 30. And we need to be able to distribute our product and pricing across the entire of North America. And typically it has to be done in less than 1 second. That goes from the point at which something happens in a game. So if you're watching NFL and you want to place a live wager on that event, something happens in that game. If we have to change the odds, we have to receive the data into our data centers. We have to calculate what it now needs to be, and then we have to distribute it down to all those data centers. And then most importantly, we have to get it to the customers. That is a very, very complicated design, and some of our network engineers are here. They deal with a lot of complexity, and the sheer volume of data that flows across our network is immense. When it comes to account of wallet, our central wallet, we want to give the best customer experience possible. The wallet, if you deposit money into your wallet, we need to be able to get you to interact with that regardless of which state you're in. However, we also have to be able to know which state you're in, and we have to be able to keep those bets, those wagers in that state up until the point the event is finished or the market has settled. That means we have a really, really complicated central platform, and money flows into a state and then comes back into that central wallet. Again, really, really complex architectures from a software perspective. Again, why am I saying this? We have all the hallmarks of a business that needs cloud to function with scale and burst. We have on-premise workloads that don't work like that. So what was our idea? How do we bring the cloud into our data centers? And this is where we use Amazon Outposts, or hopefully you're all familiar with that, which is basically Amazon servers that they host that they would normally have in a region. They put into our data centers and they manage it for us. And we do really clever things on the back of that. Which again, I'll get into some of these details in a minute. Millions of products, prices change every second. Every state needs its own hardware and data center. These are what keeps our FanDuel engineers really, really busy. Our products, we want to give the best customer experience. We want to make it be easy. We want to make it simple. That increases that complexity. And across the North America, if we focus on our hardware landscape, what does that look like? And why did we choose Outposts? We have literally 15 data centers all across the US. We have tens of racks of Outposts across all of these different locations. They are linked back to the central regions. We really like this single control plane that we get, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. The cloud-like management, it's not as perfect as the cloud, but it's much easier to do our scaling. It's much easier to do auto scaling. You code and you have a central set of teams who understand how to use normal regions. and we're allowing them to, or giving them a lot of that experience in that data center environment by simply having the same hardware platform. We'll come back to low latency and local HA in a minute. So, single control plane. We have had many, we've worked quite a lot with lots of hardware vendors. We found lots of challenges with keeping up with device drivers, keeping up with hardware supply constraints. Just getting stuff to the data center was a problem. When we talk about cloud scale, we installed our Outposts in New York on the 31st of December in 2021. The hardware was wheeled into the data center that day. We went live to our customers. We were first to launch. I think it was on the 8th of January, 8 days later. That was from hardware installation through to having a customer place their first wager on the platform in the state of New York, all because of the way in which AWS Outposts and the creative solutions that the team came up with using that single control plane. So what did we do? We pre-built all the software in the normal region, and then we simply redeploy all of our software down into that environment when the hardware is ready. Really, really simple, creative way to solve a pace issue or an agility issue. That solves quite a lot of our data residency requirements. We make sure that everything is in the right place at the one time. We create each one of these data centers like our own little mini regions. We work very, very closely with the AWS teams, particularly on the Outposts side, to simplify down that process. Everything from how they're being set up. If you're familiar with Outposts, the slotting, the linking back for high availability back to the central regions. And again, how do we make sure that we have the lowest latency? We utilize the backbone networks of Amazon as much as humanly possible, because that is infinitely greater than the wires in the ground that we would be able to buy if we were trying to solve this in the normal traditional way. So how do we get our data from our business in Australia or in Europe? We traverse that backbone that Amazon provides us in the region or between regions. The cloud-like management, an EC2 instance on an Outpost, guess what? It's the same as an EC2 instance inside of a normal region. All of our teams, they don't have to be trained on different hardware. We don't have to have different processes. It's just simple. And Amazon helps us to support all of our hardware. Low latency to the region. We talked a little bit about that global network and that global backbone that Amazon has. Getting data back to our customers, once getting it to our data centers is only half the battle. Getting it out to our customers is actually a much bigger problem. This is where the entire ecosystem of Amazon really comes into play. So we have CloudFront at the absolute edge, making sure that the customers are coming in one of the biggest front doors that a cloud operator can provide. And we do very clever things on our network to provide the right level of connectivity back into each one of these data centers that, from an operational perspective, doesn't introduce lots of complexity. There is an operational overhead of running all of these things, but our team, we have a team of about 20 people that's looking after all of this infrastructure across all of these estates. Local HA and DR, we've worked quite a bit with with Amazon around the best way to design and architect Outposts. It doesn't work the same way as a normal pair or set of racks would. Making sure that our software is being deployed correctly. All of our software is fully automatically distributed via CI/CD processes. We will, by design, redeploy every piece of software that is deployed into every one of these data centers every time a code change is made. And we not only redeploy all the software, we redeploy all of the servers. So it's not quite a container type environment where it's fully immutable. We are using EC2 instances, but we will rebuild an entire platform, move the traffic across to it, and then delete the old platform to ensure that from a HA, DR, even from a continuous availability perspective, the platform we want to make sure is on all the time. And we don't want to have to worry about somebody made a configuration change that wasn't rolled back or wasn't checked into a code repository, we guarantee that every time a new deployment happens, it is a fresh install every single time. And that really enhances that HA and DR position, because if you can knowingly rebuild an entire state or rebuild an entire application or a set of applications at the click of a button, that's what we do, solving lots and lots of our operational problems. So what does the future hold for us? We are always looking to be very creative about how we spend our money, how we can be efficient about scaling up all of these types of environments. And our growth, we deployed our first Outposts, I think it was in November 2020, and now we have nearly 15 states fully operational with across the Outposts estate. Hardware upgrades, we just tell Amazon when we want the capacity. It's not quite as easy as just building VMs or EC2 instances, but it really is give us more capacity before this date, and they wheel it into the data center and they sort it all out for us. We will continue down this path where we want to evolve, and we're working very closely with the AWS data center team and the EC2 Edge team to allow us to build a multi-data center topology in every state. So what does that mean? How do we utilize local zones as well as our own data centers? How do we utilize multiple of our own data centers to make it look like a region? How do we use that Amazon expertise that we've benefited from Outposts from a hardware perspective, but elevate that up to building region-style environments without having the costs that Amazon have to deal with? Because our environment is, we're talking about 3 or 4 racks in every data center here. We do not have the scale requirements that Amazon does, but ultimately we need to be able to provide more availability. We want to be able to use that capacity for things like additional disaster recovery postures, as well as scale up for those peak events. We're launching new states, and we have lots of network scaling. The network team in FanDuel is probably one of the busiest teams there is, because they're having to deal with all of this data that's flowing across from the customer side, just as much all of the logging and the telemetry that's needed to operate a platform of this size. We're looking at local zones, as I said. This is where bringing Amazon more into the normal cloud-like mode, but on a much more smaller scale. And generally, we're working very closely with the product teams, particularly on the Outpost side, to bring more of those AWS services that we know and love, Lambda, Aurora, RDS, bringing the high availability features that exists in the normal regions all the way down to the on-premise type workloads that exists inside of Outposts. So, happy to take any questions. That was a very, very high-level view of the types of challenge that we had. It's a very interesting set of problems. It's a very interesting set of problem statements, and more than happy to answer any questions that anybody might have. So the question was, I'll simplify it down, how do we do capacity management in a cloud-like world using Amazon? So this is where our creative solutions come in. So the easiest way to answer that is we buy more hardware, right? We talked a little bit about that CI/CD process. We deploy all of our software and we duplicate it every time we do a software release, which means we have to have that burst capacity to be able to do that. So that's a little bit, right? We have to be able to build high availability into everything. So actually, we don't install 2 nodes of a cluster, we install 3. Why do we install 3? Well, if you lose one of them, you still have 2, right? But that's extra capacity to be able to deal with that additional workload. When we look at some of our future plans, local zones is a smaller region. That comes with auto scaling. That means we don't have to invest in all of that extra hardware, and we're utilizing that shared location. It's on a smaller scale, but ultimately it will give us some extra capacity. And when we look at disaster recovery where local zones may not be applicable, we want to get to the point where we might have a data center in Colorado and a second data center in Colorado. How do we use that capacity for those peak events, the disaster recovery capacity, but actually using it in the context of being able to burst for those big events and just better utilize the capacity? So moving from an active passive type configuration all the way through to having a fully active solution between all the states. I'm not going to lie, this is not a straightforward thing for us to solve, and the way in which we solve it is we do just buy more hardware. Yeah. Again, we do some other clever things, around how our customer traffic is managed. None of it is really, overly sensitive, but we make sure that all of our customer traffic comes in one front door, right? That means that we get that scale and that the burstiness can sometimes be absorbed. Pushing the data out to our customers is actually another big thing that we do. We don't have to have all of our customers hit all of the platforms. We just need the transactions to hit that. So being very cognizant and mindful of what needs to come into the data center versus what doesn't need to be there. If it doesn't need to be there, it doesn't go there. Yeah. What is the decision making around additional capacity in a data center, if I've picked up correctly? So let's just say we start off with 3 outposts per state. If you are familiar with outposts, once you go above 4 racks, you need to have a networking rack that's dedicated just for the networking, and then you scale up after that. It typically comes back to what is our overall growth prediction, how much additional capacity we have, plus how much more efficiency can we bring into the platform. So we work directly with Amazon. We have an ongoing conversation with them around some new capabilities that are coming in the Outpost space that are available in the normal region. So testing things like Graviton 2 or Graviton, where you can bring additional capacity by simply replacing servers. If we were to add an extra rack, we would replace it with really efficient compute capacity. And we're doing a lot in that space in our normal regions, and we're trying to convince AWS to bring that down to the Outpost type of configuration. Actually. So there are 2 laws, 2 rules that we have to abide by. One is the state regulation themselves around wagering, which is done at a state-by-state level. So in 2018, the Supreme Court repealed what's known as the PAPSA, repealed PAPSA, which there was a federal law that said sports betting was illegal in every US state except for Nevada. So that was repealed, but they didn't make it legal in every state. So we have to wait for a state to tell us that they are ready. So that's the first hurdle. Second hurdle is a very different rule, which is the Wire Act. That is a financial regulation that doesn't allow financial transactions to cross state lines. So if you can imagine, you've placed a wager, but actually that wager, it has to be settled. So that entire transaction hasn't finished when you place it. It only finishes when we fully settle it and we know the outcome of the event. So for the entire duration of that, we can't have that across a state boundary, which means it has to be within a state. So a state regulator might tell us, yes, you can put it in the cloud. We don't really mind where you host it, but ultimately that second rule is what's prohibiting us from being able to do that. The ideal scenario is we have a state which has a region. They're really nice, except there's only 3 or 4 of them in North America. So we have to wait for those states to come along to be able to use the bigger regions.
Thank you. Awesome information. From the software engineering side, do you have like a production output for dev and UAT testing one, or are they all production development done in regular?
So Do we have production, development, outposts? Short answer is no. What we did was we said, we're going to test the differences between a normal region and an outpost. And guess what? They're the same. It's the same hardware that goes into both. Unlike what would typically happen in the more traditional mode, which is you might spend less money on your dev environments, you might have slightly cheaper hardware, slightly slower this, like different cables, whatever you need to do. But in Outposts, it's the same. And we do not feel the need or the desire to want to put development environments in these environments, because actually that capacity should only be used for production. All of our development then lives in the normal regions or in the cloud-like environments. And again, coming back to that single control plane, it's the same. So you orchestrate in exactly the same way if you're deploying to US East 1, US West 2, our data center in Virginia. Yeah. So the question is, what does disaster recovery look like today? It is a more manual approach. It is more in that traditional context of doing backups and restores. In some cases, we do have secondary data centers as we're building them, but our key priority is to launch first to a customer and then provide that MVP for disaster recovery, but building it back up again. As a fast follow to when we launch a new state. That means that we have to be even more cognizant of where we place things in the data center. So when you look at Outposts as a configuration, and there was a question around how do we do capacity planning and the decision making around adding extra capacity, you can choose to build an Outpost rack as a single entity and have another Outpost rack as a single entity and put them in the same room, but actually they provide high availability in a very different way to if you decided to put two Outpost racks together and join them as one, because ultimately they link back to a single control point in a central region. And depending on how big the facility is that we're operating in, depending on the location, having a server room in a hosting environment that is 1 kilometer away from the other server room, it's things like that. Any other questions? In that case, I will leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for coming along. Hopefully you all enjoyed that, and look forward to hopefully meeting some of you in many other Atlanta events. All right, thank you.